ways. Frantically, I could not find the classroom. Today reminded me a lot of that. First of all, my apologies for coming in a couple minutes late. Second is the technology, appropriately enough, in the CS. It doesn't seem to be firing my computer. So while we're waiting for this to reboot, why don't we start with two things? First of all, DC, tell them a little bit about your practice, just like a 1-minute version. Yep. And then I'd like you guys and your teams to think about giving us 3 sentences. And just so we don't eat up a lot of time, I really do want you to constrain yourself to 3 sentences per team. 1, my team members are, and please introduce your team members. 2nd, our company does X, 1 sentence. And 3, and importantly for us to have context for, our biggest legal question is why. Okay? So 3 things, start thinking about. DC, give me your 1 minute and then we'll go around.
Sure. Thank you, Brad. Thank you, Professor Hahn. So as Brad mentioned, I'm a practicing attorney at a firm called Modus Law. We're about 12 attorneys, offices in Boulder and Broomfield, and I do all transactional work. So the core areas are sort of formations and restructurings, financings of all kinds, and then some M&A work, and sort of everything that sort of goes underneath all of those 3 practice areas.
Awesome. Why don't we start here? We'll go around quickly. As I said, 3 sentences. My team members are, our company does X, our biggest legal question is why. You have the misfortune of sitting on the front end of the room. Go ahead.
All right. Hi, I'm Nick. This is Chris. This is Brennan. We recently pivoted, so we are a happy hour finder for travelers and college students. And our biggest question would probably be, I guess, foundation of an LLC and protection, kind of isolation from us and anything we do, if that makes sense.
Super helpful and a great model. 3 sentences, you pulled it off. Well done on short notice. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm David. This is Tyler. This is another teammate, Nathan. And our company does location-based messaging called Flatiron. And our biggest legal question is how to do marketing and specifically the legality within the field of e-commerce.
Okay. You might have to give us a little bit more detail as we go along, but that's totally welcome. So be disruptive. All of you be disruptive. Try to drive this conversation in a way that's useful, specific to your companies. Great. Good to see you again, David. Yep.
My name is Dan. My group members are Connor and Sean. And our project does Venmo for bets. And the biggest question that we have is transacting money over apps like that where it's not based on chance legal.
Yeah, you guys have legal issues. That'll be interesting. Great.
I'm Joel. My team members are Michael and Rafni, and we are in the process of pivoting, but our application will be think of Instagram with geolocation.
And in terms of legal issues?
I think we right now mostly just company formation and the legalities behind that, I would say.
Okay, so company formation basis. Yep.
You guys skip me. My name's Evan.
Evan,
My 2 team members are not here.
Got it.
John and Cooper. My company does like music streaming, kind of, that helps the artists more. And then a legal question I would have would just be like, giving like record labels and like just ownership or like the possibility of like streaming other people's musics and.
So things around copyright issues,
Yeah,
licensing, etc.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
My name's Gus, and we were Code Canyon. This is Hunter and Rob. We're in the process of pivoting, but what we were doing was connecting computer science experts with people who need help. And legal issues might regard liability or something along those lines.
Good. Okay. Yep.
I think there's a
Have you guys done?
I'm Rachel.
Rachel.
Partner that our app is a place for makeup users to organize, share, and discover their looks, kind of like a recipe book for makeup. And our legal question is mostly about protecting our idea and intellectual property.
Great. Are we set over here? All right, let's go to this table.
My name is Alex. This is Isaac. We've got a 3rd member, Josh. Our company revolves around security policy for startups and helping them implement one. Our legal question would be something along the lines of if we try and help someone with their security and they get hacked anyway, what are we liable for?
So not that far away from what you guys are doing in terms of some of the liability questions associated with what if something goes wrong with our product or service. Okay, good?
I'm Sean. I'm working with David and Seth. We automatically find bugs in your Android applications. Our biggest legal question is how do we deal with the liability of handling other people's intellectual property? How do we avoid getting bad things happening when somebody else's source code is on our hard drives?
Awesome, great. Let's move over to this table. Maybe we'll start in the back.
We're with Dan.
You guys are already taken care of, good.
I'm Daniel, this is Connor, and we create IoT smart vents to control temperature within your home. And our biggest legal issue is if we accidentally break someone's HVAC or set someone's house on fire, how do we deal with that?
Another liability issue related to product or service. Super helpful, good.
I'm Jeremy. My team members are Jose and Steve and Jackson, who isn't here. And we are a gamified music discovery platform. And our biggest legal issue would be how we'd be able to stream other people's music.
Not too far away from some of the streaming questions that your team has. Okay, got it? Yep. Yep.
So my name's Soham, and this is my team member Grish. Our company's job board sorted by how long it takes to apply to each position. Our biggest legal question is primarily how to create a company and then how to share the ownership between the different founders.
As part of the course, Rick, have each of the teams decided who's going to own what so far? Have you had that discussion, or does it just vary by team?
We have not had that discussion,
Okay,
so I think
we'll spend some time on that.
equity is good.
This is a super important issue for all of you, and so we're going to spend some time on that in this lecture. Good.
I'm Alex, this is Cooper and Ryan. We're like VR e-commerce. Our legal questions might be like online harassment or like patenting, copywriting the idea, something like that.
And we had a couple of people come in late, and maybe Nick in back, you want to describe?
So, who's on your team? One sentence. Our company does X, one sentence. Our biggest legal question is Y, one sentence. Go ahead.
All right, so I'm Nick. I'm with Drew, but he's not in class right now. We basically just manage sports for different coaches and automatically edit sports footage. And my biggest legal question is redistribution of Rick's streams from sports networks, or controlled redistribution, I should say.
Redistribution of content.
Yeah.
Okay. DC, any quick and dirty reactions from your end?
I guess the overarching reaction is the pretty standard normal stuff that we're seeing teams go through for pretty much every startup. So so that's sort of an overarching reaction, and then certainly the liability concern is something that's you're going to navigate throughout your business life cycle one way or another. So that's sort of an overarching reaction.
Okay, we're going to try to do 3 things in the next hour or so. We'll wrap up by 12:15. First is I'm going to highlight a few things on campus that I want you to be aware of, and if it's of interest, I encourage you to put on your calendar. Second is we will go through a checklist of basic legal considerations with the wildly ambitious goal that you don't fall asleep and drool on yourself, the table, the person next to you over the next hour. We'll try to make legal issues as accessible and interesting as possible, with the idea that that checklist, hopefully, everything's done. The other hopeful thing is you say, holy shit, we had no idea. That would be good for us to address sooner rather than later. And just to alert you, these are things that are seldom going to make your business a success. But if the business is working, these are things that they don't get addressed can crater the business. So we think these are critical issues. We'll try to give you that checklist. And third, we will try to pick up some, if not most of the issues that you guys just teed up. I will flag a couple specialty issues. The retransmission as it relates to sports content, I think we'll probably take offline. And some of the issues around gambling are very specialized as well. One of the reasons that DC was wanting to come in today is I'm hoping that we might be able to get you guys some specialized follow-up. I know that you're serious about taking this forward, so to the extent we don't address it in the next hour, to provide an invitation to see if we can get you either some help, maybe DC, maybe I know somebody. We'll talk a little bit about the Entrepreneurial Law Clinic. And then at the end, 5 or 10 minutes, I know it's part 4, we'll leave some time for open questions, but don't wait until then. Jump in. If you've got the question, decent chance someone else does. If it's highly specialized or we don't know, we're just gonna say, we'll take that offline, but don't hesitate to ask. Work for everybody? All right, so a couple things. First, as I mentioned, I wanna get some things on your calendar if it's of interest. One is on next Wednesday, we've got a series over at Silicon Flatirons called Entrepreneurs Unplugged. Has anyone been to an Unplugged session before? All right, well, I won't be patronizing anybody except for DC to tell you that this is more or less entrepreneurial storytelling. And next Wednesday's story is from John Levesey. He's the CEO and founder of a company called Craftsy. Craftsy does online content, which is going to be of interest to many of you, around, yes, crafts and arts. And the kind of thing that you'd think, how do they get anybody to pay for this in the era of YouTube? They did. Massively successful company. Also interesting in a second dimension, I gave a talk there a couple of years ago at one of their quarterly retreats. About 60% of the company, female. Very interesting in terms of gender dynamics for a high-tech software company as well. John is great. That's a ton of fun. Easy, accessible conversation. 5:30 in the courtroom. It's free for students at the link. And I've given Rick the slides, and you guys can link from there. Also, Ryan Martins. Anyone familiar with who Ryan Martins is in town? CU alum, CS, I believe. Rick?
I don't know if he's CS, but
All
he
right,
might be.
engineering
He
at
might be.
least.
Yeah, engineering.
All right, if we broaden out to engineering, he's one of your peeps. Okay. Also built what, for my money, was one of the most thoughtful, intentional companies that I've seen in Boulder the last 15 years, called Rally Software. This should sound familiar to you because your co-professor in this class, Zach Neese, was the CTO of Rally Software. Ryan is going to be part of a series that we've got called Tuesday Morning Coffees. We do this with Hack CU. And the whole idea is in a relatively small group setting, kind of like this, if not smaller. Ryan's going to be talking about his story and just riffing with you guys about things around entrepreneurship. Great opportunity, highly recommend, and that's going to be Tuesday the 30th. And then finally, you guys have talked about the New Venture Challenge in here. Silicon Flatirons leads the information technology track. Every one of your companies fits into the IT track. And here is what that is going to look like. Starting on February 1st, we've got a resources workshop. Encourage you to go to identify, here's something that we're not getting yet. Is there a resource on campus or in the community? If we don't know it on the spot, we will try to get you that as follow-up. The following week, on the 7th of February, we've got a coaching night, which will be an opportunity for each of your teams to get some live in-person feedback on your idea or a problem that you're having, as well as potentially to connect to some community mentors. And then looking out a little further, the IT track semifinals is going to be in March on the 12th, the track finals the 19th, and for those that advance out, the championships is in April. So encourage you to get those on your calendar. Any questions about some of these upcoming events and whether it's a good use of time? Well, I guess you either trust me or mistrust me, and there's no question about it. Yeah, go ahead.
So our company is, we're kind of halfway between the IT track and the research track. I think we registered for the research track. Are you allowed to kind of leap between the two?
Yeah, I would encourage you, just vacuum up all the resources that look valuable, and especially early, I might parallel path and see what feels like it's going to be more useful for your company. Okay. It's funny, the mentorship in the New Venture Challenge often works like this. Your company gets one mentor, and then by the end, if your company's doing well, about 12 mentors say, yeah, I really gave them a lot of help. And you realize that the good companies are just vacuuming up the help. So be greedy with the resources. That's what we're here for. Good question. All right, that's part one of the discussion. This is the thrill of the New Venture Challenge. This is my favorite. This is a team called Riderama, which is somewhat of a bittersweet story in the NBC. They won the title. They had some computer science students on that team. You can see that their personal hygiene might have needed a little bit of work there. But that is the glory of the moment in which they won the NBC. They also essentially had Uber before Uber. They were a ride-sharing company back in 2008 or 9. And, appropriately enough, for this class, got tripped up by the legal. The Colorado State Public Utilities Commission told them to shut it down, and rather than fight it, they went ahead and shut it down. Interestingly, Uber, of course, when they were told to shut down, they just kept operating, they fought, and they ended up winning a lot of legislative and PUC victories, including here in Colorado. But anyway, that's something to look forward to. Although if you win the NBC, bring some deodorant. Okay. All right, preview. Here's the checklist of some issues that are going to matter that we'll riff on a little bit. Again, I encourage you, jump in, ask questions. We'll try to tailor it to your companies, but please jump in. First, get into a limited liability entity. Let me pause and ask, how many of you have formed a company with a Secretary of State, whether Colorado or elsewhere? What did you guys form as?
Framework Minor LLC.
LLC, Colorado?
Yep.
Okay.
Mine was before this class.
And?
It was just a group with Jose.
Yep.
Just founded a company to.
In Colorado did you form?
Yeah, in Colorado.
What kind of company did you form?
Just a web development company.
And LLC,
LLC.
corporation, LLC, got it, yep.
LLC Delaware.
Delaware LLC, great. For this company that you're working on now? Got it, yep.
Flatiron Inc. Incorporation, not a S Corp or C Corp yet until April tax filing for this year.
Okay, by default, you are a corporation for now. The question is whether you'll make a tax election. You've got 75 days to make that tax election?
Yeah.
So 75 days after you form with the Secretary of State, you need to make that S-tax election if you want to. Otherwise, the election is made for you and you will be taxed as a C Corp. Make sense? Okay. All right, so that's number one, is get into a limited liability entity. Why do you want to pay attention to this? Because all the companies that have liability issues, and many of you are self-aware about them, and many of you who are not will be self-aware soon, it's worth it, it's easy, and what this does is protects you. We'll talk more about that. Second, founder roles and ownership percentage. A team over here talked about founder ownership. We're going to go into that. Related to that is what I call the wayward and the walkaway founder issues. We'll highlight why I think those are important to be alert to. Fourth, we'll talk about identifying some of your intellectual property. I think I heard some companies talking about that. In terms of name, we'll talk about some basic trademark diligence and way to help yourself before you get too invested in a name. Fifth, contracts, and especially contracts as they relate to making sure that you are locking down the secret sauce of the company. Or to mix metaphors, identifying here's the crown jewels. Let's make sure that if the company works, we are protecting our crown jewels from the start. Okay? Now, you're going to hear Dave and I probably talk out of both sides of our mouth a little bit, because we're like, yeah, talk to mentors, get help, expand about your idea and get some input from others, and then on the other side we're going to say, but protect your idea. And we can talk about where the rubber hits the road, how you can achieve those two objectives. And then finally, more or less, just a caution, when you go out to raise money, you are going to be selling a security. And we are going to tell you, hire DC, hire a professional attorney at that point. I'm not someone that's going to tell you have to hire a professional attorney for everything, but when you have someone buying a stake of your company, things can go wrong. And securities issues is something where you really want to get some professional help. Anything in terms of the menu here or what's not here that you would like to add?
I would just echo a huge point on the walkaway and wayward founder point. I think I have 3, maybe 4 clients right now dealing with that exact issue, and that's just this week. So it's I would just echo that's a big one on the list, along with the IP protection early on. So we'll get into all that a little bit more.
So there's the roadmap of where we're going. Please jump in along the way. Issue number 1. Get into a limited liability entity. What do I mean by that? That act of filing with the Secretary of State, which some of the companies have done in here, but not everybody, does this. It divides your bucket into 2 different buckets. One is your personal bucket, and you are effectively separating out that personal bucket from the business bucket. So what does that mean? Let's take a scary worst case scenario. Let's say we have the security company. Which team's doing the security? Okay, give me a worst case scenario as to where that goes wrong.
All of our clients get hacked anyway and blame us.
Okay, so you guys have a product that's security, they're relying upon it, and they get hacked. And let's just say it causes $2 million worth of damages to their business. Okay, everyone with me in terms of the factual scenario? Okay? And let's assume, arguendo, there is something defective about the product that led to this hack. We'll just assume, I know this could never happen with someone as bright as yourself and as gameful, but we're just going to assume that's the case. Okay. You have a bicycle? Car?
No.
Bank account?
Yeah.
Personal bank account?
Yep.
Okay. Business bank account yet?
Not yet.
Okay. And let's say that you got a personal bank account with, we'll call it, optimistically, $50,000 in it. Shaking his head, we'll just say there's $50,000 there to be recovered against. A bicycle that's pretty high end, we'll call it a $1,000 bike. Nice bike. Yes, no? No, whatever. Fanciful scenario. And a business bank account that we'll say has $25,000 in it. Okay. Can the business that was damaged by their product recover against the business's $25,000 account after this hack? Yes. Pretty straightforward, right? The business has $25,000, the business caused this harm, they should be accountable for the damage. $1 million of damage, we'll get the $25,000 from that account. But they're not satisfied, right? There's plenty that has not been remedied. So they go out, and your name again is?
Alex.
Alex. They say, Alex, sorry to do this, but we're going after your personal assets as well, including that personal bank account of $50,000 of the next year's tuition and costs, as well as his bicycle. Can they reach that? What does it depend on?
If you have a limited liability entity.
And what does the limited liability entity do?
They're suing the entity rather than suing you. And so if they're suing the entity, they can take the entity stuff, but if they're suing you, they can take your stuff.
Wow, do you have a legal background?
No.
Lawyers in the family?
Yes.
Ah, well done, that's exactly right. So the act of filing with the Secretary of State says we used to have everything in one bucket, Alex does currently, and now we're gonna separate it out, and we've now got a business bucket that is separate from his personal bucket. Now I want you guys to become law students for just a second, and I'm gonna ask you why, as a matter of policy, that is, why do we allow Alex to separate out his personal bucket from his business bucket? Why does the Colorado State Legislature say, if you form a limited liability entity, we'll separate these two out?
Small entrepreneurs can take risks, bigger risks, and stimulate the economy.
That's exactly right, is we want to encourage the right amount of risk-taking, and the balance that's taken is, your business is still gonna be accountable for its mistakes, but we are not going to punish you personally, Mr. and Mrs. Entrepreneur, so severely so as to chill the entrepreneurial undertaking, okay? So my message to you, if you take nothing else out of the next 50 minutes, is when you start operations that could expose you to liability, get into a form of business that separates out these two buckets, okay? Dave, maybe I will tee you up to talk about a couple things that once you formed the business at the Secretary of State, here's how you keep those two buckets separate.
Definitely. Yeah, and I would also add, just in terms of the broader picture of what you file. So if you file for a general partnership, that doesn't give you the protection to separate the personal from the business assets. And so that would just be, yeah, it's another form of entity that the default is if two people do business together, they're considered a general partnership. And so if you just never get around to forming your entity, potentially you're opening yourself up to be treated that way. So I just want to add that piece. And then not to get too sort of wonky on some of the legal stuff, but what it's called is the corporate veil, is the separation between personal and business assets. And so courts in every state have gone through this test. It's a lawyer's favorite thing, a multi-factor test. To determine, did the operating of the business maintain that separation, that corporate veil, and if it didn't, a court can do what's called piercing that corporate veil and still get through to the owner's assets for the purposes of that lawsuit.
What are the three most common ways that entrepreneurs blow it and fail to keep that separation between the two buckets?
Maintaining only one bank account, so putting business funds in your personal account and vice versa, so commingling is what that's called. Failing to sign properly a contract. So if you just say, you know, John Doe on a contract, the person is not on notice, that other party is not on notice that you're doing business as an entity. They'll think it's just you. And so that's one way where folks get tripped up. And then it's really a matter of separateness overall. So everything you do should just be separate. And that's really the
So let me put a fine point on it and we'll open up the question. So going back to Alex's example, in addition to organizing with the Secretary of State, in order to keep those two buckets separate, what does Alex want to do? He wants to go open a bank account in the business's name, and then you run the business's affairs. You cut the checks out of the business's bank account as opposed to your personal bank account. Make sense? And when Alex and the company go out to lease space and they sign that lease, you don't want it to be hugs and kisses Alex. You want it to be Alex CTO Security LLC. And that provides notice to the landlord that he or she is entering into a business with the business, not with you personally. Question?
Yeah, so in terms of mixing, what about like computer hardware that you're using for your startup? Like if it's your own personal stuff that you're just saying, well, I'm gonna use this stuff because it's here and I don't need to play video games right now. Does that mix
Great
things
question.
at all?
DC?
The most conservative route would be to essentially what's called contribute that property to the entity, and that can be done when you form the company. So if it's an LLC, you have your unit or percentage interest that's issued to you. You can contribute property and money and everything in exchange for those interests. And so if it's going to be used exclusively for the business going forward, you would want to go ahead and just contribute that property to the business. Now, it's a little bit more of a gray area if you're going to use it for both, and it sort of becomes a personal laptop. You might be doing some work on it for the company and some not. And you would just want to be careful about what you're putting on that and just be mindful of, if you're just checking email, no big deal. If you're really in depth doing some things for that on that piece of property, it starts to sort of get into the danger zone.
Don't freak out about that early on. We recognize you guys have computers that you're doing your company, the class, you may be doing some outside work on it. That is fine. But just be mindful of, are we blurring this line? As DC said, it's a multi-factor test. The easiest way to blow it is to commingle the funds in the bank account. That's a pretty bright line thing. Take that step. And then as others go along, just be mindful in the big picture as to how this works out. Don't freak out about being perfect. Just start acting like this is a separate entity from your personal. Yeah.
So would that be the same thing for like when you pay? Like let's say you invest your own money into the company.
Mm-hmm.
So like you transfer money from your personal account to the business's account. Is it the same kind of thing, or you like?
Yeah, you'd write a check to the business or deposit cash.
And you want to have, from a corporate perspective, approvals. So if you are a corporation, there should be documentation that here's the deal, it was approved by the board, and that money has been deposited. Again, acting like you are separate from the business and the requisite formalities are approved. Make sense? One more, Dave?
So CU has an acceptable network use policy. Specifically for my team, we have a server that is going to be hosted on campus. Could CU at any point claim ownership of our intellectual property?
CU has a policy that they will not make a claim solely on that, especially for undergrads. The way that CU could have a hook into your companies is if you are using grant money. That is going to be a flag where you want to have a discussion up front about who's going to own the intellectual property over the IP that comes out of that grant. But just by being in this class, just by using CU's network, not going to trigger a claim from CU. Okay? Good questions. All right, so hopefully I have scared you sufficiently, and if not, we'll have some other worst case parade of horrible examples. Okay? You want to get into a limited liability entity, but what are these things, you ask? You've got some inclination. Here are 3 examples, one of which you're probably going to be choosing. Now there are other forms, such as, for example, in Colorado, a public benefit corporation, which will provide you that limited liability protection. If you are going to be a for-profit company, traditionally you're going to be either an LLC, a limited liability company, a corporation, and there's 2 flavors. One is you form at the Secretary of State and do nothing else. Then you are what's called a C Corp, a C corporation. Or you file as a corporation at the Secretary of State, and then you take an additional step and say to the IRS, the Internal Revenue Service, for tax purposes, we want to be taxed as an S corporation, and then you are known as an S Corp. Just to be clear, if you are a nonprofit, if you are a public benefit corporation, you also get this limited liability protection. So don't go for the head fake. Okay? All of these things accomplish the fundamental goal that we started with of separate out the personal bucket assets from the business assets. That is point number 1. Yes?
When you're saying contributing hardware to the company or anything else, do you have to like explicitly declare that you're contributing it somewhere? Like, how do you do that?
Oh, easy?
Yeah, we would usually do it in the documentation to issue the equity as just an exchange. So you're purchasing the equity.
And equity is,
property.
some of you guys know, this is a term for ownership of the company. So in exchange for your ownership in XYZ Corp of 25%, the company will say, you're contributing these computers and this equipment, and in exchange for that, we will give you 25% ownership of the company.
That's usually can be a combination of, intellectual property, intangible property, tangible property, maybe a little cash. It can be fairly broad on how you're phrasing the contribution. If it's a very specific asset, like a registered trademark, for example, or something that is very, very specific, then you usually just list it as a schedule to that agreement.
Are these just documents that are held onto by the company, or are they like filed with the Secretary
All
of State?
internal.
Great question. And you nicely set up the next conversation, which is how do we organize in the Secretary of State? Okay. First question before we get there is going to be, what's the right type of business? So, for example, why do I care whether I am an LLC versus a corporation? Okay. And I'm not going to go too far down this rabbit hole, but here's a checklist of some of the things that you're going to want to look at. One of which is the amount of flexibility. The short version of this is the best thing about an LLC is it allows you and the other owners, which in an LLC are called members, it allows you and the other members to pretty much run the company from an organizational perspective the way that you want it to run. The awful thing about an LLC is that it allows you and the other members to run the company the way you want it to run. Okay? Now this leads into how do you organize the LLC. You are going to file at the Secretary of State in Colorado, if you organize in Colorado, something called the Articles of Organization. It's really a pretty simple document. Someone who's organized at the LLC in Colorado, you find it takes 10 or 15 minutes. $50, is that what it is right now?
Yeah.
$50, not very complicated. Okay? And that's all that you're going to file with the state. That alerts the world that we are doing business as Security LLC, not as Alex in person. Make sense? Okay. The second step to organizing an LLC is you and the other members need to get together and create a contract called an operating agreement. The operating agreement is going to set forth who's going to own what in our company, and moreover, here's how the governance is going to work. Here's how the voting is going to work. Here's what needs approval from everybody. Here's what only needs a majority approval. Does that make sense? Okay. That document you hash out with your co-founders and perhaps in connection with an attorney, and that does not get filed with the Secretary of State. So really 2 things that you have to do to create an LLC. Dave?
So LLCs don't actually have to declare shares or equity.
DC, you want to talk a little about membership interest?
So in that case, vesting agreements don't apply unless you have a corporation, correct?
Part one, yes. Part two, no.
Yeah. Yeah, so what an LLC has by default are membership interests. And those membership interests can be denominated in percentages, or they can be denominated in units. And so for most sort of startup companies, sort of your classic startup that's going to go as a LLC, and I think it's becoming the norm now, but I know we do it as our default, is to set companies up as a unit-based LLC. So it mirrors the structure of a corporation and shares of stock the same way that that a corporation would set up. So it makes that vesting math, the dilution math, all of that less of a headache. And rather than saying, oh, well, we're going to vest 30% of the membership interest over time, and then a year from now you add 3 people, and then you have to go back and figure out what that does to the 30%. And so with the units, you just issue additional units like you would shares of stock. And you pretty much get to just flat out make up the number of units from the start, you could say. And usually there's sort of a million or 10 million, something like you would do with authorized stock in a corporation to address that. And then it makes the vesting agreements a lot more like a corporation from a I guess terminology perspective.
So we're going to come back in 10 minutes to vesting. So for those of you that might not have fully followed that, in 10 minutes we're going to come back and revisit that issue. I want to say 3 more quick things, and then we're going to move on to the next topic. Okay? The first is, what should be the drivers as to why you might want to be in an LLC versus a corporation? One is going to be tax considerations. And we're not going to go too far down that, but just put that out there. One nice thing about an LLC is it's something called a pass-through entity, which means that you don't pay taxes at the business level. Instead, Alex pays taxes directly as an individual. Okay? So there's only one layer of taxation in an LLC. That's also one of the attractions of the S Corp, why you might make that election. Okay? In a C Corp, you pay taxes effectively twice. We call this double taxation. Why? Because the corporation has to pay taxes in the first instance, and then when money gets kicked out to shareholders, the shareholders have to pay taxes as well. Now, as a matter of the math, it doesn't come out as double taxation. With tax reform, it might not be as much of a difference as it used to be, but just be aware that's one driver that might make you think at the outset an LLC sounds better to us. Are you with me? All right. Second, if you are raising institutional money, that is venture capital, within, say, 12 months, and DC, disagree with me if you have a different experience, but within 12 months, and I mean you're talking to VCs, and I mean that Zach and Rick are telling you your company is bankable in the next 12 months, then you might just go ahead and organize as a C Corp. I'm not going to go into the details, but just know if you're raising outside money from a venture capital fund, not necessarily an individual angel investor. If Rick loves your company so much that he's coming in as an individual, you can still be an LLC. But if Foundry Group comes into your company as a fund, they are going to say you have to be a C Corp. Don't freak out. If you're an LLC, it's not that hard to go from an LLC to a C Corp. Not that hard. It is more difficult to go from a C Corp back to an LLC. Okay? So if you're within 12 months and you think you're going to raise institutional capital, rather than do the brain damage of that, you might as well just organize as a corporation. But I'll just give you this caution. We always ask entrepreneurs, what are you going to do for funding? Oh, we're going to do a VC round in 6 months. Do you know any VCs? No. Are you talking to VCs? No. Have you ever raised money before? No. You're not raising money in 6 months in all likelihood. Okay? So be realistic about that. Zach and Rick can help you guys size that up. That's the other factor that I would say. Last piece. Delaware, Colorado, what state should we organize in? I would suggest on the front end, absent good reason otherwise, consider Colorado. Okay? Just costs, administrative ease, management, a little bit cheaper. Okay? But at a point in which you're going to raise outside money, or scale up, you will in all likelihood move from Colorado to Delaware. Why is that? Delaware's law is very robust on the business side, it's well built out, and they have some specialized courts that make decisions a little bit faster than other jurisdictions. And serious investors will say, I love your company, I'm in, but we're gonna move it out as a corporation to Delaware. Okay, so be ready for that down the road. DC, any additional thoughts on that?
Yeah, just on the moving, the state choice, you can, when you, what's called convert from LLC to a corporation if needed, which you can do right at the time of the transaction. It's a fairly simple thing to go through if you needed, but you can also move states at the same time. So you could go from a Colorado LLC to a Delaware C Corp as one transaction prior to the closing of your financing. The other piece on the tax side is if you have a foreign owner, LLCs are often a little bit challenging there because the person who might live abroad is gonna all of a sudden have US tax liability, potentially, just by virtue of ownership. And so we had this situation come up, actually it was yesterday, a client wants to hire a Brazilian developer, he lives in Brazil, has no plans of coming to the US, and so there were some challenges around that. And then the last piece with the C Corp, just to add some of the lack of flexibility on the tax side once you get in there, we have a tax lawyer that we work with in Boston for specialized work. He refers to the C Corp as the Hotel California, so you can check in, but you can never leave, and you're just stuck as a C Corp pretty much forever, and it's really, really difficult, or really, really expensive from a tax perspective to change the other way, and so you just lose all that flexibility if you start as a C Corp regardless of state.
Perfect. Okay, are you with me? That's the first section of the course. Get into a limited liability entity. The forms of limited liability entities include LLC, C Corp, S Corp, nonprofit, public benefit corp, any of those things. When do you need to get into it? Maybe now, maybe not. When you are exposing yourself to liability, when you're putting your product in customers' hands and you're like, God dang it, if something goes wrong, I don't want to lose my bike. Okay? That's about the time to get into a limited liability entity. Are we good? Second, decide on your founder roles and ownership percentage. DC started talking a little bit about vesting. We're going to come back to that, and we're going to talk about two specific scenarios as to why you want to get who owns what and on what terms does that look like done now. And by now, I do mean now. I don't mean necessarily when you organize the entity. And I think it's even more pronounced of an issue since you guys are in a class where, you know, some of you might take this forward. Others are like Microsoft and Google and Facebook are calling. You know, they're going to cut me a check. I'm going to go pay off my loans. Love you guys like a brother and sister, but I'm out of here. Okay? And you need to have a transition strategy in place for that. And so I think this is important for everybody. Okay, what is the wayward founder? Here's the wayward founder. Actually, I'm going to reverse this. The walkaway founder is the one that I just teed up. Your name again is? Soham? Yeah. And your partner is? Grish. These guys have a company that seems to be working, and Grish loves it. Class ends, he takes it forward, and you're all in. Soham gets an offer from Facebook to come out at $150 a year next year. He's like, Grish, man, I got to go pay the bills. Good luck to you. Okay? They're 50-50 partners. What did Soham just walk away with? Half the company. What does that do to Grish's motivation in terms of this company going forward? Grish, how do you feel about this?
I don't feel good about it.
No, you're going to build it, make it a success. You put in all the work, and you're sharing the wealth creation with someone who's walking away. Doesn't seem right, doesn't seem fair, not great for anybody. What do you put in place? A vesting schedule. What does that look like? It says, Soham, you're in the company because you're going to be involved to do these things. And we think those things, X, Y, Z, are going to require your full-time involvement over the next 4 years. So yes, you own 50% of the company, but if you walk away in the next 12 months, the company can buy that stock back for a penny, okay, on the cheap, and you walk away with nothing. Okay? After a year, a quarter of your 50% ownership will vest. Yeah, it's proportional to the 4-year vesting schedule. And after that, with each month, you earn another proportional share of those of that stock. Okay? And then after 4 years, that full 50% of your ownership is vested. That is, you own that free and clear. And then even if you walk away, you own it because you've now earned the stock or the ownership. That's the essence of vesting. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, does everybody need to do a 4-year vesting schedule? No. If some of you guys have already contributed important things, such as cash, or you've done all the code for this company, you contributed that, you and your co-partners should talk about that. Hey, I've done the code, I've put my heart and soul into this course during Rick and Zach's time, and I think it's fair that, yeah, I own half the company, but it's only a 3-year vesting schedule, and we're gonna say that a third of my ownership is already vested. So even if I walk away tomorrow, I've earned that piece of ownership. Does that make sense in terms of the essence of vesting? That prevents the wayward walkaway founder problem, where Soham, you get a great job, you walk away from the company, and it demotivates everybody else. Are we clear about that? Questions about vesting? Let's talk about the other problem, which is the wayward founder problem, and that one looks like this. You guys hug each other at the end of the semester, you go separate ways, and again, it's Grish. Grish takes this company forward, raises outside money, goes to Y Combinator or Techstars, gets a big round of funding, and by the Series B round, Foundry Group is in for a $10 million check. This company gets TechCrunched, and Soham is out in the valley, and he's reading TechCrunch. He's like, Grish, man, wait a second, he's making this company a big success. This is no longer something that is just a class projecting company. I mean, this company's got a real chance to make me rich. What does Soham do? He calls Grish. You know I own half the company, right? Grish, what are you talking about, man? We never talked about that. I know, I was a co-founder with you in the CS class. I hatched that thing. We were 50-50 partners. Soham, no, you're not. Okay. If I'm financing that company and they're having this fight, what do I do if I'm a venture capitalist? What do?
Pull away your money.
I've got other companies to invest. I do not need a fight as to who owns what, and this is the kind of thing that will crater a company and crater a financing. Pretty simple way to get ahead of the wayward founder problem. Again, talk about who owns what, get yourselves on a vesting schedule, put it down in writing now. Are these conversations going to be easy between you and your co-founders? Not necessarily. But I'll tell you this, if you cannot have this conversation with your co-founder today, it's going to get a hell of a lot harder in 3 years when there's real money at stake. Okay? Have the hard conversation now. Who owns what? What have you contributed so far? What do you anticipate is going to be contributed in order to earn that ownership stake over time and get ahead of the wayward and walk away founder problems? Put it on a vesting schedule. DC?
And the other, you mentioned time-based vesting. Another strategy to prevent these issues is to use some sort of milestone-based vesting, so sort of objective, determinable events. So if it's release of the MVP or whatever the case may be for your particular company, you can have shares or units vest on that event, irrespective of when it occurs. So that might be another way to address some of these elements and make sure people are all in from the start.
I totally agree, and there may be some bright line things that you could talk about in terms of when I contribute this code, it'll be my certain percentage will vest in terms of ownership. Be cautious though. If we say you contribute, I don't know, what would be a certain number of lines of code, Rick?
5,000 lines.
Thank you for preventing me from embarrassing myself. 5,000 lines of code, you earn 5% of the company. What do we know Grish is going to do? there's 5,000 lines of code coming, right? Does the company need it? We don't know. Is it any good? We don't know, but you're getting 5,000 lines of code out of Grish. Okay? And so that's the danger of milestone vesting. But in some instances, this can make a lot of sense. Another thing you just say is you're going to be working full time or working on average 20 hours a week on the company, or 10, or whatever it is that's realistic in the company. And hard cash at the end of the day should result in ownership percentage that's not necessarily subject to vesting. Okay? You're bringing cash to the table, that is what it is. Okay? One final note about the vesting. If I come in as a venture capitalist or an angel investor and get behind Soham and Grish, they tell me, yeah, we put ourselves on the vesting schedule and we already own half of our shares, and we're not going to want to subject them to further vesting. What is an outside investor going to say to that, just to set expectations?
No.
No, why?
I said,
oh, I'm sorry, yeah.
Because they want a share in the company and they want to be able to grow their shares, other people invest as well.
Okay. When they get behind Grish and Soham, who is the outside investor believing in? Grish and Soham. And the outside money is going to say, hey, I know you guys put yourselves on a vesting schedule before. I am going to reset that, because if you're going to put my money to work, I need you guys here for at least 3 more years. Okay? And just know that's normal, and it makes sense in the big picture that if you're going to take somebody's money and put that to work, you need to commit that you're going to be there for a while. Does that make sense? Yeah. Yep.
So vesting sounds great. Is it in the form of like a contract that's just signed by everybody?
Do you see, mechanically?
Yeah, mechanically, so if it, depending on LLC or C Corp, it might go by slightly different names. Sometimes it's called a restricted stock agreement or a restricted stock purchase agreement. And essentially it's just a contract between each founder and the company, and sets out the terms of the vesting, and really the basics of acquiring that stock, as well as reference to the, I'm sure you guys have heard, the 83B election issue.
Actually, I'm sure they have not heard.
Have not.
Maybe you heard of the 83B collection.
I take for granted
Well,
sometimes.
2 sentences maybe on 83B.
It's a tax election for when vesting is involved, to allow you to take the, if it's in exchange for services, to take the taxable event on the day of grant rather than as each time the shares vest. So if it's a new company, when in the eyes of the IRS, the company is worth 0 or close to it, you pretty much always want to make that election. The kicker, and
This is a great point. Let me just underscore what David just said. So, Soham and Grish ill-advisedly follow our advice today. They say, hey, we're going to own this, here's who owns what, and they put their ownership of the company onto a vesting schedule, as David talked about before. Within 30 days of that, you guys probably would be wise to make what's called an 83B election, where you pay taxes on the ownership value of that stake that you just took. Why? Because you want to pay taxes now, and it diminishes your tax hit later if the company is going to be valuable. Because you're paying taxes at a point in which the company's just not worth a whole lot. Make sense? DC.
And it's one of the few areas where there's no actual fix if you miss the deadline. So this is one of the areas where it's really bright line. If you miss the 30-day window, you missed it. And to address it or to mitigate the damage is not fun. So word of caution as you get sort of these things queued up. But that mechanically, you'd want to do that within 30 days of the day of grant, in connection with signing this stock purchase agreement. The timing of that becomes interesting in an LLC, because somebody has to own that LLC from day one. And so as a pass-through entity, the IRS says, well, your allocations and distributions from a tax perspective have to be going somewhere, unlike a C Corp. And so the timing of those grants and who owns what and when become really important that you should work through with your advisors.
What prevents you from doing this 83B election as soon as you form the company and it's worthless?
You get busy and forget.
Yeah, you should.
Yeah, you should do it. If the company's more mature, sometimes there are reasons not to, but those are very rare. And so generally, the advice is, you know, you have to do it.
Now, making that specific to where you guys are in the class right now, you could probably go one of two routes. One is, so I'm in Grish, you guys could formally issue ownership in the company at this point, and then you want to make sure to get that 83B election done and formalized. You could also come up with something that's good enough for purposes of this class. Here's what we agree between us as to how the ownership is going to look for the duration of the CS class. And then at the conclusion, we're going to round up and talk about who's going to take this forward, are we going to take it forward, and if one of us backs out, here's what we agree the ownership will look like, and then you could formalize it at that point. Does that make sense? Because I understand that there's a little bit of an in-between where this is building a real company, but you're also doing it in a class setting where you're not necessarily sure that these are the people you want to be married to for the next 4 years. Right? You've got a nice opportunity to decide that, but you might leave that opportunity for yourself to make that decision at the end of the class. Yeah?
So if during funding or hiring people as you're growing, you want to modify this ownership schedule, is that more difficult after this 83B election, or is it possible after the?
It's particular to the founder, so
Okay.
it's for each founder's personal taxes, essentially. And there are some company effects, but I don't want to get into those. But essentially, it's for each founder. So each founder has to make this election on their own behalf. And so if you add someone to your team later, and that person gets equity subject to vesting, then they would have to file.
One more question. David?
So what percent of ownership would make someone a founder or a co-founder?
Question. As well as, what is a common question when you actually get to the rubber hits the road. How do we decide these issues about who owns what? Like, why should we just go 1/3 each, or are there other considerations? DC, what do you say? And I've got a link that I could send over in terms of a framework for thinking about founders' issues as well.
Yeah, so there's lots of information out there on a framework of thinking about it, and a shameless pitch for lawyers. They can help you with this aspect of it because they see all these different companies forming and can give you some market perspective, accountants as well. But especially in Boulder, there's a lot of great business early stage company lawyers, and they can give you a good market perspective. So that's one way to sort of help work through that process. I would say sort of the co-founder would be, if that's what the term would be, it would be probably 10+%, sometimes higher depending on how many current founders there are. If you were just going to hire maybe a CEO or a really key employee, not necessarily consider them a co-founder, might be less than that, and then a contractor even less. And then you might have sort of an occasional advisor where you just want to say, here's a little bit of a lottery ticket for your help, and that would be sort of less than 1%, maybe 1/4%.
You see, for employment law purposes, 20% magic number. Do I recall that? I shouldn't talk out loud. I'll find out. I will get you back.
I think so, yeah.
I've got in my mind, there is a magic number that exempts someone from certain employment laws in terms of ownership percentage.
I think it's 20, yeah.
And I got 20 in mind, but don't write that in the notes because I might not have that correct. Okay. I'll try to follow up on that. Okay, 2 things I want to cover in the next 5 minutes just because they're important and generalizable, and then we'll take some specific questions.
We are going to bring in an IP lawyer
Okay.
as a guest speaker.
I'll be very fast on that then. With respect to IP, let's go back to a scenario in which Alex Security LLC is working with somebody, and who's, your name is? Dishita. Okay. D, and Alex are good friends. Alex knows that D's a rock star coder. She's not working with the company as a founder, but as an independent contractor. That is, you're outside, like, D, you're the only person that could do this. We'd sure love to have you develop this piece of code for us. D says, absolutely, $5,000. Alex says, I'm in. Okay, $5,000. D does it, gives it over to Alex Security LLC. And it becomes an issue later as to who owns that piece of code that D developed. Alex LLC or D? What's the answer to this? Who owns it? Alex does, why?
Paid for it.
Paid for it. And we want to take the contrary view. Yeah,
It depends on the contract that they sign, I guess.
and let's say there's no contract, just they're good friends, handshake. The answer is probably D, even though she got $5,000 for this. Now, Alex's company probably has a right to a license or something to use that software, but absent a written agreement that says, I transfer, I assign ownership of that intellectual property, the independent contractor will arguably retain ownership. This is the one of the most counterintuitive parts of the law, because everybody thinks what you just did, which is, hey, he paid for it, the company paid for it, why do you get the windfall of getting paid and keeping the ownership? So what's the key here in terms of takeaway? If you're working with someone outside the company and there's intellectual property involved that matters, get a written agreement, even if it's simple, that says for $5,000, D agrees to transfer and assign all ownership rights in the intellectual property over to the company. Some of you might be working as independent contractors right now. This is also good for you to know, right? The default law might be a little bit more in your favor than you think. Or you might say, you know, I've got a real expertise in the security stuff. Alex, I will give you a license, but I'd like to be able to use this code with other projects as well. And then in the contract you put in, here's what you get and here's what I'm retaining. Make sense? Just super counterintuitive part of the law, and I want to make sure that all of you guys know, whether you're on the company side or the independent contractor side, what that looks like. Yeah?
So when you're doing all this, it seems like there's a lot of contracts, a lot of documents you have to write up. Do you have to have a lawyer go do all those?
Not necessarily. And so, you know, the operating agreements get complicated. Really nice if you can work with a lawyer on that. Until that time, something that's good enough, I will tell you, in my estimation, you are better served to have that conversation about who owns what, how we're going to govern the company, and if there's a vesting agreement. And even if you're hashing that out yourselves in writing, that is better than nothing. Okay? At a point in which you can go get a lawyer, do it. The hard and fast rule that I'm going to give you is if you're raising outside money, you absolutely have to have an attorney involved. One nice thing is associated with CU, you know, DC being here, the Ontario Law Clinic, New Venture Challenge resources. Not everybody's going to get the full boat of legal resources, but we can try to get you some resources along the way as well. Yeah.
So we talked earlier about venture capitalists not wanting to invest because your investing scheme is like already run 2 years in, someone already owns a large proportion of the company, and they're about to throw all your money in, and they want to make sure that you still do work, right? Do you need to have a dissolve clause or something like that?
I'm so glad. So if that's what I said, that's not what I meant.
Sorry.
What I meant is you guys have a vesting schedule. Outside money will say, we are going to reset your vesting schedule. And I am going to get them to commit for another 3 to 4 years as a condition of my investment. Okay? So they don't have to dissolve it. We'll just figure it out, but we'll have them agree that some percentage of their ownership or the new ownership that they get in the future will be subject to vesting.
So the same vesting contract is just reinitiated?
Something like it. Conceptually, it's the same. It'll be a new agreement. But as a condition, I'm investing in those two personally. And this is important for early stage investors. They'll probably like your idea, but it's going to be a lot less about the idea and more about belief in you as a founder. And so they want to get a commitment that you're going to be around for a while. Make sense? Okay.
Did you want to mention dilution at all, or?
Yeah. So the reality is, when you take on money from the outside, your ownership percentage is going to drop. Right? You're 50-50 owners. I come in and buy half your company. Now you're 25% owners each. What does that mean in terms of control? You have less control than you would if you didn't have an outside investor involved. Does the value of your ownership stake drop? No. You're 25% owners still in an entity that's worth more because I'm bringing outside capital and you're hoping to grow it. Okay. Do you see anything else along those lines?
Yeah, so I would just, I guess, give an example. We work with a former founder of a certain rubber shoe company, and when they went public, he had, I think, under 10% of the company, even though he was a founder. But that under 10% was worth a couple $100 million. So it didn't really matter that he was diluted down to that portion because there was still value to be had. And then the other piece that we see a lot of confusion over is people wanting something that's non-dilutable in terms of percentage. So it's really, I guess, comes naturally to people to say, hey, I'll give you 5% for your work. And you want to get that clarified as soon as possible that it's X amount of shares or units. Because if you just say 5%, a lot of times that person hears non-dilutable 5%. And so if you add an investor or other founders and you start giving people away something that's a material amount of the company that's non-dilutable, anytime you want to add more people or additional investors, where do you think that dilution is coming from? It's coming from the original founders, and they're going to take all of it, which is generally not a fair outcome. So just be very careful as you're bringing team members on, you're clarifying that it's, you know, a number of shares or units that today represent 5%, 8%, whatever the number is.
Just to make that specific, DC, we're gonna bring you on, you get 5% of the company as of January, what's the date, 18th? Is that right? As of January 18th, 2018, and that is 5 shares out of our 100 shares that have been issued and outstanding so far. That is fixed, right? There's no debate as to what he has. And then as we have future investments, that 5% will do what? It's gonna shrink, right? But there's no argument that this is 5% forever and all time. Make sense? Okay, last point, which I'll just reiterate, is you are about to raise outside money from an angel investor, from a venture capital investor. Don't try to do this by yourselves. Please call DC, call somebody else, ask me for a referral, and get the securities issuance done the right way. When people lose money, sometimes they sue. And if you've got things set up the right way, you're gonna protect yourself. If you don't, you're gonna leave yourself exposed in a way that you're gonna turn it into a much bigger problem. Securities is something that can be complex, just a simple, flat statement. I see, Rick, that we have pretty much run up to the goal line here in terms of time. Do you have a few minutes if we stay on afterwards if there are specific questions?
Absolutely.
Rick, anything before we wrap up that would be good to address?
I think you've covered the basics that we really wanted you to take the class through. So yeah, let's thank our guest speaker. And I'll also mention that we do have the next assignment I'm going to post tonight about getting your first 10 customers, Professor Mueller's guest lecture from last semester. I'll post that and it'll be due next week.
Thanks for having us here.
Yeah.
What's the new little password?
I'm going to post all that on Slack tonight. So.